All right.
Go out of the practice room. No, it's sticky.
Say again, Linda.
Welcome. We will be starting the program in 2 minutes. Thanks for your patience. Welcome. We'll be starting the program in about 1.5 minutes. Thanks for your patience. Welcome. We'll be starting in about 30 seconds.
Can we give it another moment, Amy?
Sure.
Let's do that. All right, maybe I should get us kicked off. So thanks for attending, everybody. I'm Chip Loeb. I'm the president of the Jewish Humanity Foundation of Greater Mercer. The foundation is the Jewish community's philanthropic partner. We work with individuals to develop and implement philanthropic plans, and we work with our partner Jewish organizations in managing their endowments. As sponsor of the Life and Legacy program, we've secured well over 600 promises, each of which represents a promise of a legacy gift to one of our partners. Also, as evidenced by tonight's program, excuse me, the foundation presents enrichment programs to the broader community to honor the legacy of specific moments and people in Jewish history. Tonight, we're going to hear about a young woman who is studying to become and eventually becomes a specialist in a new practice called obstetrics. Took place around the turn of the century, the previous century. The protagonist is determined to improve medical safety for women when choices for treatment were limited. While it's a fictional story, the main character honors the legacy of many, including Jewish women, who rallied to expand the rights and opportunities for women. So tonight I get the treat of introducing our speaker, Jane Loeb Rubin, who is the author of this book that she's going to talk about, In the Hands of Women. Jane is a retired healthcare executive and ovarian cancer survivor, and she's written 2 historical novels, both of which explore these themes that we've talked about. And the second one will be coming out in about 6 months. On a personal note, Jane's my first cousin, and I'm thrilled to be able to introduce her. And I've watched her for, I don't know, Jane, 2, 3, 4 years, and have always been blown away by how hard you've worked on this and how much it took to actually put a novel together, one I enjoyed immensely. So before I turn it over to you, Jane, 2 quick things. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website. So if you know someone who's interested and couldn't join us, please be sure to share that with them. Also, we will have some time at the end of the webinar for Jane to respond to questions. Please enter them in the chat box, and that will be monitored. Over to you, Jane.
Hi, everybody. As you heard, my name is Jane Loeb Rubin, and I really would like to thank Linda Mizell and Amy Zaks and my cousin Chip for inviting me to this important event this evening. It's always my delight to go out and talk about In the Hands of Women, because as you have probably found with most authors and their programs, they hold their books very dearly to their hearts. And my book came about because of a shared relative who Chip and I both have, and that was my great-grandmother, Matilda. Matilda came to the United States as an immigrant in 1866 from Germany as a German Jew and settled probably in Harlem when Harlem was still farmland. And my ovarian cancer, when I went to trace it genetically, it found its way to Matilda. Matilda died years before my father was born in 1925. And she was reportedly ill with some type of woman's disease. So at that time, that was the euphemism for breast cancer, ovarian cancer, names that people didn't say out loud. Once I became sick, I started a fund called the Matilda Fund, and it's a research foundation. The mothership is in New York, and the Matilda Fund funnels money into the Mother Foundation. And it was very important to me. And over the years, I've raised money for that. So, and I have friends who are legacy givers, and it means a lot to me personally. So every year I would write a note to my friends and family, people who would donate to the fund, and update them on innovations in ovarian cancer treatment and so forth. And as a result, the stories every year became more involved. After I retired, I began writing a development letter, and all of a sudden I thought, well, gee, I really should give this woman a life. And that became my first novel, which is going to be released in May. It needed a fair amount of work, so I thought I'd give it a rest. And while I was giving it a rest, I had an inspiration for a sequel. And the sequel is In the Hands of Women. It was published in May of this year and has done extraordinarily well. And I think its success has been really connected with it deals with obstetrics at a time when there were laws that forbid birth control. I mean, the Comstock laws of the late 1800s made it impossible for people to practice any kind of family planning to speak of. And abortion became illegal. Prior to abortion being forbidden, midwives typically handled terminations in the very, very early months of pregnancy with herbals. And so they were mixed into teas, and sometimes they were in pill form, but it was generally not instrumentation. And at that time, the common thought was that life did not begin in utero until the woman felt movement around 18 to 20 weeks. So people really didn't bat an eye. It also coincided with one of the most massive immigration waves that went on ever in US history, where people from all over Eastern Europe were flooding into Ellis Island, oftentimes well over 1,000 people a day. And some went west, but a great deal of them stayed in New York. And New York these immigrants were poor. They were our predecessors. They were poor. They were beaten by the world they were fleeing from. They were young, and they were not terribly well educated. And they lived in the tenements across Lower Manhattan. There are almost stripes going down the city. If you went from east to west, you would walk through the Italian tenements, you would walk through the Polish tenements, you'd walk through the Jewish tenements in the Lower East Side. And people were all very much alike in many ways, except for the religious symbols they hung on their walls and doorways. They had the same basic needs. So my protagonist, Hannah Isaacson, is becoming an obstetrician in the midst of all of this. There were women were getting abortions and they were illegal, and sometimes they got into a lot of trouble. The midwife did. And what was also happening with the midwives was interesting because as doctors began to practice obstetrics in hospitals with anesthesia, midwives began slowly losing their business, particularly their paying business, because at that time people paid cash to hospitals. And so those midwives had to find other ways to supplement their livelihoods. And they really were not trained to, it was illegal, but they were also not trained well to do anything with instrumentation because they learned by apprenticeship method. They didn't have formal education. Nursing schools were still relatively new, and there were very, very few midwifery schools. So Hannah finds herself in this climate of constant challenge. And on top of what was going on in reproductive health, she was also female and one of the first women doctors. And the story opens with her at Johns Hopkins, and she's dealing with terrible discrimination against the female doctors. And so she has quite an uphill battle. And through a lot of very misfortunate events, finds herself finally successful at Mount Sinai in New York, where things seem to be going well for a while until she finds herself in a somewhat of a setup. And I don't want to give a spoiler, but she ends up having to deal with the harsh reality of Blackwell Island. And through her connections, is able to become released and so forth. But through this journey, she becomes very close with the suffragette movement in New York, and Margaret Sanger, who was at that time in her late 20s and was a real leader, a real high energy lady in that movement. And the focus at the time was to get birth control legalized. Now, that becomes even more complicated in a way because people didn't understand ovulation yet. So there was no rhythm method. There was virtually no reliable form of birth control. So that was a very, very serious problem. But in the process of connecting in with Margaret Sanger, she begins to learn how important it is to have a community of women working together. Up to that point, she was kind of the long distance runner. She was the smartest girl in her class. She got into this medical school at Johns Hopkins, but she was finding herself very isolated and alone and lonely for a romance too, because she was surrounded by a lot of non-Jews, and she really wanted a secure future with someone of her faith. And that is another arc in the story that's part of the ride. So what the other process that I'd like to share, so that's the basic story arc. And I've been invited to many book clubs now. I have a website that is in the chat that not only informs you as to how to purchase a book, but my website, my author website, has a lot of interesting material, and I generate a kind of bi-weekly blog that talks about the writing experience and some interesting facts that I came up with. So what I found, which was delightful for me, was that within a few weeks of getting my book out, looking for publication, I was offered a contract, and it was very surprising because I really didn't imagine that it would get that far, but it did. And recently I was offered another 2-book deal. So the first contract was for 2 books, which was very fortunate because I had written both of them already. And once In the Hands of Women was going through the polishing phase, I pulled Threadbare back out of my drawer and rewrote it. And so now that's, as of 2 weeks ago, I handed it off to my publisher, who is in the process of editing it and hopefully doesn't have too many major revisions, because I'm beginning to work on book 3. And it's all been very, very exciting. It's going to be a trilogy following the same characters. But interesting to note that Threadbare, which is coming out in May, is a prequel. So it's the story of my great-grandmother, Chip's great-grandmother, based on less than a handful of facts. So the book is really fiction. Many of the characters are totally invented, but what wasn't invented was the harsh reality of that time. It was such a different time than today. There was the prevalence of epidemics and different diseases was something that people really feared. There was an infant mortality rate of 20%. Babies on the average had an 80% chance of living till 1 year old. So many, many families lost children. And the overall average age life expectancy was under 50 years old for both men and women. The common diseases that people died from, the top 3 causes of death were all related to infection: pneumonia, tuberculosis, and GI infections, because there was no refrigeration and it was really easy to eat very spoiled food. And so those were the 3 causes of death: cancer, heart disease, diabetes. They didn't even make it to the top of the list. Accidents, they were low also. So life in the tenements was precarious at best. Aside from the fact that there wasn't a lot of money, there were outhouses in the back of those buildings. People had chamber pots. There were very poor ventilation. And for anybody who's had the wonderful experience of going to the Tenement Museum in Lower Manhattan, you can see that it is just a little better than a dorm room in terms of space. And oftentimes there are up to 10 or 12 people living there. So it was a very, very difficult time. And the major advances that we have come to take so much for granted, like penicillin, did not come along until the 1920s. So these diseases that were bacterial in nature were virtually untreatable. Surgery was very, very dangerous. They used different chemicals to try and keep wounds clean, but many, many people died of infection. And it just was a really challenging time. So one of the things that brought me into that realm of medicine in that period of time was when I thought about Matilda, and I thought about what it might have been like for her to get breast cancer, ovarian cancer in her early midlife, and to not have any real treatment. It made me really begin to drill into the research and investigate what it would have been like for someone, and that is built into the story material as well. There were a number of very interesting facts that I came across along the way. At Blackwell's Island, which was where the prison system for Manhattan was during that period of time, 20% of the women who were admitted into that prison were pregnant. And those babies who were born in the prison, if they didn't have an immediate family member to hand the child off to, would go to an orphanage. And in that orphanage, that child would you know, some of you may have read The Orphan Train and books of that nature, but that child could disappear into society and become untraceable. And so women were very, very afraid to deliver at the prison. The prisons had very, very primitive medical care. And on Blackwell's Island, there were 2 hospitals. One was an insane asylum, and one was a charity hospital. And that is where poor people were sent who had tuberculosis and other diseases that needed to be cared for away from the general public. But while Canna is at Blackwell's Island, she discovers that most of the inmates are non-Jews, and it leaves her wondering why. And it left me wondering why that was a situation at Blackwell's. And when I went down into the Lower East Side, one of the many times I did gathering information for the books, I realized the infrastructure that had been set up by the community to help immigrants it was really impressive. There was a Henry Street Settlement building was there. And that building provided all kinds of basic care for new immigrants, not only helping them learn English, but pointed them to places where they might be able to get work and help them develop a network into the Jewish community. And I think that legacy is one that really runs through the Jewish people, of looking out for each other in times of need. And I think that as a result, there were fewer people who became incarcerated because they did have help to turn to. Unfortunately, for the Irish, that was not so much the case. The Irish, the main wave of Irish immigration took place during the potato famine before the Civil War, and it just flooded New York with poor, uneducated people. And the churches, they never got ahead of it. They were just always behind the 8 ball in helping bring these people in a meaningful way into society. Excuse me, I was just telling the group before we went live, I spent a week with my grandchildren, and I think it's virtually impossible not to come away with some kind of a cold. So I've got my beverage here. I don't know how many people have read the book, but if you have any questions about it, I certainly would welcome them. I'll be getting on in just a moment with Linda, who is going to have a discussion session with me. And Linda, I mean, if you want to start, we can get started on it.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jane, for such an insightful presentation. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Linda Mizell. I'm the executive director here at the Jewish Community Foundation, and we'd like to continue the conversation with some questions, first from me and then from our chat box. My first question is, I found Hannah a very appealing character, and I'm just wondering, you know, as you develop the personality of your characters, how, you know, what were you thinking about when you were creating this particular woman? Because she was different than other women of her time, in terms of her pursuit of a medical education. So share some thoughts about that.
The fundamental question I was asking myself, and this was based on everything I knew about Matilda and the women who came after her in that branch of my family, was that they were all incredibly bright. And I figured it had to come from somewhere. And I decided, let's say it came from Matilda. Then the question I asked myself was, what would a young woman be like who was that bright and had that much of a desire to reach out into the world and self-actualize in some way that was more than the traditional expectation of the time, which basically was to be a wife and a homebody and observant in the synagogue and do community good. But what about the brilliant mathematicians and the people who really saw beyond? And so those were kind of the motivators that started in Threadbare with Tilly and then carried through to Hannah, her younger sister. And so the second book, In the Hands of Women, is about Hannah's story. So Tilly kind of teased her up to go to medical school. Everything that Tilly would have wanted to do, she makes sure her little sister gets to do. And but yet Hannah's complicated. Hannah was virtually abandoned by her parents, and she has a lot of insecurities around that.
Mhm.
She has a lot of nervous habits that worried Tilly during Hannah's growing up years. And although she's really, really bright, she's a loner. And she doesn't really know how to reach out to others for help. She tries to solve problems by herself. So she's a complex gal, and she does a lot of growing up in the course of this book.
Yes, absolutely.
Mhm.
Thank you. How do you think Hannah's Judaism impacts her life and her journey and her beliefs?
Well, in this family, as it was in Chip and my ancestral families, it was a very Reform family. I mean, they came over in the mid-1800s at a time when Reform Judaism was really blossoming in Germany. So it wasn't like the Bialystoker village that came to Lower Manhattan, and they were very Orthodox. This group of Germans tended to be very liberal-minded about the structure of the religion and the tenets that many other Jews followed. So Tilly and Hannah were pretty free thinkers. However, when Hannah leaves the Jewish education system and goes on to college and to medical school, she finds herself really alone, like one of the only Jews. And it affects her ability to court because she really is not fully at ease with the non-Jews in her world and the men in particular. But she hangs on to certain things. And I think the things she hangs on to are most principally the value of helping others in need. And I think that's very embedded in the Jewish culture to help heal other people. And heal doesn't necessarily mean cure. It means to bring them into a better state of health, which could also mean helping them cope with the disease that's on their plate. And so I think it came through in that way. I also think that she was unusual in that in medicine, she really did learn about that illness hits everybody. It's not it cuts across every economic level. It cuts across every color of your skin. It is a universal issue in our world. And I think it also made her very tolerant of others. And you see that in the prison where she really goes out of her way to care for people in need.
Great. Yeah, I think that that's true.
Mhm.
And in terms of her sort of connection to Judaism and the Jewish way of Gimilut Hasadim, of caring for others in that sense. Our foundation works closely with individuals on creating a charitable legacy. How do you think, I know you talked about the legacy of your family, but how do you think the idea of legacy shaped your book in terms of the legacy of women in particular?
Well, that's kind of it's a complicated question. I think most women who have in their lives attempted to stretch their wings and to drink the Kool-Aid of you can be anything you want, and have gone off to college and to professional school and so forth, find themselves at times quite surprised by how much women have to sometimes struggle in the workplace and in professions and so forth, so much more than it seems that men need to. And what might be assertive behavior in a woman and have negative spin might be a characteristic in a man that's considered perfectly acceptable. And so I think that that's one of many, many examples. I think there's still issues with equal pay and so forth. And I think that with reproductive health, which is central to in the hands of women, that the women's right to make decisions about her body is one that women have just fought so hard for. And it goes back to that the suffragette movement and the genesis of what happened during that time. The suffragette movement started in the beginning part of the 1800s and entailed thousands of women working on all different aspects of rights that women did not have, whether they were the right to inherit wealth or property and education, healthcare, and really across the gamut. And in order for women to finally get the vote in 1920, the sea had to rise. All of these different parts of life had to improve. And that was done by a cast of thousands, and many of whom didn't live long enough to see the vote. And since the vote, it's been a continuation of one brick after another, kind of building women up to have equal rights to men. And I think that one of the most a lightning rod in all this is reproductive rights, because they were so central to what women could or could not do as they grew up, from the time of Tilly's life through Hannah's and on to today. And that is why it was a big focus in the book. And interestingly, I finished the first draft a year before Roe v. Wade was overturned. So I didn't know that was coming. I really just felt there was so much heat in the air about the issue of abortion, the issue of a right to determine what a woman wants to do with her body, that I just, when I started seeing historically what had happened at the turn of the century, my feeling was that it's so important to educate women about the history behind all of these issues. And the amount of people who fought for many, many years to acquire one right after another. And my personal feeling is that I don't think we should let go of anything, and anything at all. And I think these are deeply concerning issues that are personal. But whatever your position is on the political spectrum, it should be an informed position based on a knowledge of facts and not fiction. And Linda, this is very much like we were chatting about with what's going on with these demonstrations. People don't have the facts. they're not making decisions based on fact patterns. So that is really a big driver. That was a big driver for me.
Well, I was
Right.
going to say our next question, which comes from the chat room, is have you seen a different response as the political climate has changed? And have you seen a shifting response to the book by the readers? You speak with book groups. Have you seen a different response as our political climate is shifting?
Well, that is an excellent question. And I was really kind of nervous about it, actually, because I always end up in the middle of these controversies. I seem to have a magnet for them. But I very intentionally in the book did not take a position on abortion. I think that, first of all, I think that was a secondary issue in 1900. It's a very, very important issue at this moment. But in 1900, the bigger issue was birth control. Because if birth control was widely accessible, there would be a lot less need for abortion. So and Margaret Sanger saw it that way also. She felt like and just as an aside, there's like so much interesting historical information that you learn that you can't put in the book. But Margaret Sanger was a woman who was one of like, I don't know, 8 or 9 children. Her mom died from tuberculosis in her early 40s, but she had been so debilitated from pregnancies and miscarriages, and she was always pregnant, and with the tuberculosis it basically wasted her. And Margaret was up close watching this happen and taking care of her. After she died, Margaret was able to convince her father to let her go to nursing school, and then she spun off from that and became a midwife. But her biggest issue was in the very beginning was that women should be able to control their family size when they get pregnant and when they give their bodies time to recover between pregnancies. And so at that time, that was really the focus. So when people kind of try to push me a little bit and the book talks, I usually answer in that manner. And then with the abortion issue, I go back to women's rights. I mean, I think that, nobody knows where I personally stand on abortion because I think it's a personal choice. But I think everyone is entitled to that privacy to make that choice without somebody allowing or disallowing it. So that's where I stand on it. That's how I handle it. That's a good question, though.
I have another really good question. If you could be transported to, so thank you, audience, for these great questions. If you could be transported to 1900, do you see yourself joining the suffragette movement or more like breaking barriers like Hannah, using your becoming educated, more of an individual way of affecting change?
Well, I think the education was something that Hannah was able to have because of her sister. So she didn't acquire that education on her own finances. She was given that opportunities. And so it really would have depended on the opportunities I was given. The likelihood is I would have probably been more like Matilda, who had to leave school at 8th grade, as many, many young girls did in the 1800s. Matter of fact, I had a statistic, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was like 10% of Americans finished high school and before the year 1900. It was not everybody went to high school or college. And as a matter of fact, the other year that grade that a lot of people exited was fourth, because the feeling was that they could read and write at a limited level and they could work with numbers. And what else did you need if you were going to work on a farm? And so they could read the newspaper and so forth. So if, like Tilly, I was only given an 8th grade education, I think that I would have followed her route, which was very clever. And I'm not going to tell you what it was, because I think
Right, don't be a
it's
spoiler.
out of the book, but I think that I would have developed out of my own personal sense of industry.
So one other question, again, from the audience is, in this historical fiction writing, do you have role models or mentors who you have looked to? Were you always a reader of historical fiction? I mean, how did you land in this place, so to speak?
That's a great question. I was always a big reader, and in high school, I couldn't stand history because it was so full of dates and battles and names that I couldn't put a face to, and just a lot of memorization. And I had no interest in it. And when I was in college, I was kind of like business, math, science, and I never took history. And I all of a sudden got really interested in the history of medicine and started reading a lot about that. And I ended up taking my career into healthcare administration. And I found the innovations in healthcare to be just absolutely fascinating. And, there's so much that's happened in the last 150 years in the healthcare arena. If I look at myself, I'm a 14-year survivor of ovarian, and I've been in treatment the whole time. So I've been the recipient of one new drug after another that has had nice long lifespans within me. So innovation to me is like key. So my interest in medical history kind of started getting that together with traveling as I got into adulthood, got me very interested in what life was like as we went back in time. And it's very interesting to think that the one thing that hasn't changed is human nature. So when with your questions of what would I have been like in 1900, my nature is to be very curious and I get spilkies really easily if I'm just sitting around not doing anything. I can't really play cards for any length of time. I just don't get joy out of it. And so I had to come up with something really interesting to do when I retired. And it's like one thing led to another and led to another. And I began to enroll in writing programs, because as a healthcare executive, I wrote in bullet points. And God forbid we used an adjective anywhere. It was supposed to be virtually scientific writing. And that's what I learned: concise bullet point writing. And so when I started thinking about writing a story about Tilly and about her life, I had to really learn the whole construct of what it took to write a novel. And I'm even on my 3rd novel, I'm taking classes, I have writing groups. I have a meeting with a mentor tomorrow to go over the points of view that I'm writing in my 3rd book, whether I have too many, whether I should be in 1st person or 3rd person. I mean, there's so many mechanics that are involved in novel writing. And it's been, as a retired person, it's been like a whole new education, which has been so stimulating and enjoyable for me. And that's why now, as people are reading the book and they're they're getting a lot out of it, and they're coming back to me and wanting to talk about it. And I mean, the reviews on Amazon and Goodreads have been blowing my mind. And that may be why I got the second 2-book deal, is that maybe they just wanted to get me secured.
Well, and as our final question, when discussing In the Hands of Women with others, I know you go to book groups or just even in casual conversations. For you, what are the takeaways from those? What are the takeaway messages that your readers want to convey? Clearly they're enjoying reading the book, but there are many takeaway messages in the hands of women. And I'm curious what some of the different book groups say.
There are two fundamental messages that are important to me to communicate, particularly to women of all ages. And one is that you never know what you're capable of if you don't challenge yourself. So Hannah had to stand up against some really tough stuff. And there were times she just wanted to fold over, but she dug in and she found a lot of strength in herself. And it's been like that for me on my cancer journey, of not letting that define me and sort of rising above it and putting it in. I had a rabbi said, put it in a box. And you take care of your will, you take care of the things you can control, put it in the box and live. Well, I think that there's a lot of that in life where you can't let your adversity rule your life. You have to decide what you want to be, who you are, and you need to just put your energy behind that and find joy in it. The second very important theme in the book is that you can't do great things alone. You never can. George Washington may be the name we put behind the Revolutionary War, but damn it, there were a lot of soldiers who fought in that war, and he never could have done it alone. And that's true with science, that's true with education, that's true with raising your children, that it takes a village to make really good things happen. And Hannah had to learn how to trust people. And so she trusted the trustees from Johns Hopkins, and they came to her aid when she needed reinforcements, Margaret, her sister Tilly, and she, by the end of the book, had a real posse of women. And I think that a lot of young women who are struggling to make it in their careers sometimes try to do it all by themselves, and it just makes the job infinitely harder.
So I love your phrase, posse of women. I agree with you. And do you have any suggestions for how women writers can create that posse of women, or in order to support their work?
Yeah, there's a lot of organizations for women writers right now, quite a number of them, and some of them have programs and classes. And so individuals who have found success in the writing world will teach a class and share some words of advice. On a more micro level, I don't know anybody who can write a great book without having a writing group, critiquing work in a positive way, with suggestions of alternatives of how to cast a scene, or whether a scene even belongs at that part of the story. And I find my writing groups really important for me, and I have changed up them when they no longer serve their purpose. So you evolve as a writer as you get better and better at it. So your need for the level of feedback changes.
But it
And-
sounds like in your experience as a writer, people have been generous in terms of sharing their wisdom and knowledge, both as mentors and for feedback.
Yes, but it's not a perfect world either. There are there are plenty of people in writing, particularly because I mean, I didn't realize a lot of this until I kind of came into it, but it's like a pyramid. There's not a lot of Ann Patchett's at the top. There are, the top is very narrow and it's a small field. The base is enormous. It's enormous. And to get even midway is Herculean. And so my goal as a writer was to get somewhere into the middle of the pyramid so that I had a regular readership who would look forward to my next book, and it would get easier as I move from book to book. There are people who have put their foot out in front of you. There are people who compete in a crazy way for different speaking engagements, and I've seen some pretty rough stuff out there too. But I'm a big girl, and I've been in the working world a long time, and I have learned to just turn a few degrees and walk the other way. It's kind of like when you're writing, I see it as a series of traffic circles. You're working your story, you like the direction it's coming, but all of a sudden, because of time and place and historical events, you got to make a decision about which way you're going to go. And that is going to take you off in a new direction. And I think that writing and any vocation is like that. You hit an obstacle, whether it's somebody else or whether it's the economy or whether it's a pandemic, for goodness sakes. And you have to be resilient and figure out, well, what is really the best way to go under the circumstances? And I think I've learned to be pretty agile.
Thank you. Thank you for being so frank, and thank you for this evening and this talk. It's really been very interesting. And I want to thank our audience for tuning into the talk. We're very grateful to you, Jane, for sharing. Oh, great. Thank you. For sharing your time and your insights and the book In the Hands of Women with our group. I just want to remind everyone that we have a couple of upcoming community programs for mothers on December 3rd at 10:30. This webinar will feature archaeologist Leonard Rutgers. Again, lots of historical stuff. Who will present new insights into the history and ancestry of Ashkenazi Jews. And this is co-sponsored with the Jewish Federation of West Central New Jersey. And then we are bringing back Ben Dworkin, who is Dr. Ben Dworkin, the founding director of the Rowan Institute for Public Policy and Citizenship. He's going to be talking about what should be top of mind for the Jewish community in the 2024 elections. And that is on February 12th. Again, Jane, thank you so much for being a part of this evening. We really enjoyed listening to you. And to learn more about the Jewish Community Foundation, please reach out. The website link will be in the chat. Thank you again.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, everybody, for coming.